Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology. And with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. Where are you right now? Have you ever wondered? Maybe you're in your room. Maybe that room is in a certain city, which is in a certain country, which is on a certain continent, which is on Earth, which is in the Milky Way galaxy, which is in the local group, which is in the Virgo supercluster, which is part of the Locality supercluster, which is in our universe. The answer largely depends on your frame of reference, which isn't normally a problem. But as usual, we're going to make it one. Places are static, but none of the things I just listed are. Today, we're discussing locality. So we've had an interesting string of episodes leading up to this, and I think that this is going to be not so much, it'll be an extension of the conversations we've been having, but I also think that it's going to, in many ways, provide a counterpoint to them. You know? And so I think that, we've had a long string of getting real carried away down the rabbit hole of these abstract sort of arguments against the space and time reality that is, we think of as being the foundation of physics. So this will kind of bring us, I think, in some ways back to that. And then we'll be able to look at it within the context of this discussions we've been having and really sort of form a bigger picture of the universe we live in and the world we live in.
I love the way you started it because I don't know if you've ever read the play titled Our Town by Thornton Wilder. And there's a quotation. One of the things that a character in the play is she's firmly certain of who she is. She's been figuring out, but she's got this young person, but she's says in mailing a letter or receiving a letter. The letter said, Jane Crowfoot, the Crowfoot Farm, Grover's Quarters, Sutton County, New Hampshire, United States of America, continent of Northwest, of Northern America, and it goes all the way up, the Western Hemisphere, the Earth, the solar system, the universe, the mind of God. And the postman delivered it just the same. But that was the address that was on it. Right.
Yeah, it makes you, you think about your 3 lines address that you put on your return address on the envelopes back when snail mail used to be a thing. And you go, man, you can just really keep adding lines forever. But in some cases, generalizing to that point is unnecessary just because of our local frame of reference. But
it is, but the frame of we're going to keep it. We're going to bounce between the abstract and right on the ground because locality, in part, to me, is about the connections and the relationships of people. You don't know everybody, even in a little town. People think they know everybody, but they don't. There's some people they choose not to know. There's some people they categorize and put them aside, and all those things. But there's still some webbing, and this leads me with this. What you just said was leading me to think about a letter I got. Really, it was an envelope with a picture in it with a couple of written words from my granddaughter, very, very recently, and the envelope said, "Grandpa Norm, Warsaw, New York," and it got there. Had a stamp because the people in the post office figured it out.
Yeah. So there's that human element of being able to determine what was going on.
Yeah. So what locality in part on the ground stuff is, where are we? But it's always in relation to other people. And we can get to that. But
yeah. So I think that's a perfect segue into our first question, right? Which is, can you give us a brief overview of what a location is so that we can tear it apart?
Well, I'll try, and then you'll of course add to it and modify it and blow me out of the water. A location is a place that's indicated by coordinates. on a map in relationship to latitude and longitude, which are constructs, of course, because they don't really exist on the Earth. We've made them up. If we're talking about a location on Earth.
Yeah, we can start there.
And it is mapped. It is placed in estimations or consistently find measures of how many miles or kilometers it is from any other locations. So if you're talking about a town, if you go in the town, then you got streets. If you have streets, then you have parcels, acreage, property, and eventually, but things can be located by the context of nature around it. Is this in wetlands or drylands? You go to a contour map and you find out whether it has elevation or is below the water table or whatever. And so a location can be established orally, visually, mathematically, scientifically, cartographically.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really good overview of like how we deal with location on a daily basis. And it's funny because even though the overview is very thorough and it's very accurate, there's still so many things that get lost in it, right? And I think about personal examples. A guy at work, who loves fishing, right? He's fishing in the middle of a body of water, and a guy comes out onto the bed of the stream and starts yelling at him to get off his property, right? And the guy says, well, according to New York state law, if the water is more than 3 feet deep, it is a public waterway. So you don't own this water because it's more than 3 feet deep. So I'm going to continue to fish. And you think about like how problematic that is, right? Because you go, well, depending on the time of year, the water level is going to rise and lower in a body of water. So does what belongs to the public, and New York State vary throughout parts of the year, and there's, we have the same problem on an international level, right? International waters are 11 miles off of countries' coasts. Well, I know there's one spot in Russia where the land went around in such a way that Russia owned all access to a section of water, but that water was international water in between. And so countries were just sort of slipping in and, taking all the fish from the international waters and, sort of messing with the Russian fishermen, these sorts of things, right? So this idea of, okay, well, what constitutes a boundary, right? What is a location, right? Yeah, and which in some ways is a separate topic, but in some ways is very pertinent to the idea of locality.
The more we try to box it in, and that's an example I didn't know about. That's a marvelous example. With our artificial, arbitrary attempts at perhaps rational or logical demarcation, the more trouble we're asking for.
Yeah, and you think about, we talk a lot, and we will talk a lot about sort of the non-Euclidean nature of the geometry in reality, right? And sometimes that's lost on us living on a spherical planet, but you go, okay, well, how far underground do countries own, right? And if you think about that, okay, well, the greatest area is going to be on the surface of the sphere. So as you go down, you're going narrows. So like, how far down can you go? Who owns Antarctica? Who owns the moon? All this type of things that are purely human considerations, but that are important for discussing locality.
Yeah.
And of course, you and I were just talking before the show, I like the big abstract things. You like a lot of the interpersonal things. And of course, there's a crossover. Yeah. We both are very interested in both topics, but I'm always thinking about that bigger slant. And so we'll get into some of that as well. But how did the idea of locality affect pre-industrial philosophy? What was going on with ideas about location before the Industrial Revolution?
Before the Industrial Revolution, location, well, there are still a number of things. For instance, language. Language has always been a consideration in philosophy, as long as people have spoken and written. Linguistics didn't exist until later, but there's one level, which is the locality of how words work and how grammar is established, and parts of speech. And I don't know if you've even read about it, but I think, yeah. And so you have an interesting thing in which people make a decision collectively or half consciously about how a sentence should sound and function because of the location of the different particles in those sentences. And what that leads to, of course, because humanity being what it is a preferential thing, which then sets up a class system for language, which then sets up boundaries that people have to be able to cross and use the language a certain way, or you're just not good enough. And that was going on back to the beginning, you know, and it's not about accent. It's about how one uses the words.
Yeah, it's about location, right? And it's funny because we were sort of talking about this before the show, right? My last name is Bouchard.
Yeah.
Right. So if you think about Bouchard that you'd run into in Paris versus Ontario versus Louisiana, right? I think that people bring their own preconceptions about what the individual might be like based purely off the location in which they are located. Right?
Yeah, and the name that is associated with the location. So if you put 3 Bouchards from each of the places you just identified next to each other and had them speak and had somebody guess which place they were from, they might well be able to because of the inflections and the accents. But that's about location. That's just one thing about location. And then, of course, we're back to ancient science about the location of the Earth in relationship to the sky, and all of the different iterations of the Earth is the center of the universe. But first, the Earth is flat, and then we figure out that the location it's not a flat location. It's actually round. Oh dear.
And that's sort of like a detail that just gets glossed over in philosophy and history so easily. But you have to think about like how drastically that shifts your paradigm as a human being.
My gosh. Even now, you think about people love to laugh at flat earthers. And I think from the number of pieces that I've read about this, I encountered one once, a person who was adamant that the world was flat. And though you offer various suggestions about seeing why it's not, if you go far enough in a jet and you're flying, there's always a counter to that, because the viewpoint governs the mind in that case. But yes, what you just said. You mean we sail? We're not going to sail off the edge of the world? And people literally thought they were going to fall off the world. That's a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah.
Watch Pirates of the Caribbean sometimes. See how that looks. Right? So yeah, that's a major paradigm shift.
We're just thinking about the admonishments of your mom when you're younger, right? You're not the center of the universe, right? Well, I think that it is shocking on an individual and a sort of ontological level to realize that you're not the center of the universe, right? Mm-hmm. To realize, the Earth actually goes around the sun, and the sun is just one. That this is just the solar system. Oh wait, no, there's a galaxy. Oh wait, there's hundreds of billions of galaxies. Wait, there might even be other universes, that sort of thing.
And
right?
We're flying fast and furiously through the universe, but not at the same speed as every single thing else in the universe, because now we found out very recently that in fact that isn't the case. Things are moving at various speeds. How does that happen? So that takes us back to the idea of location. When you can say, I am at the edge of my shadow, I cast a shadow. We figured this out way back. Okay. then there's a relationship between where you are and the end of your shadow. And as that increases, then, oh, okay, now maybe that thing that's located in the sky but moves is doing something with the shadows. So even back then, on that level. And then we have mathematics.
Yeah. Yeah, I just attended a talk by a NASA guy at our public library. He came to give us a talk about the total solar eclipse we're about to have, right? And that's what he's just gushing about, shadows. He's a physics teacher, and he says, shadows are just so cool. He's like, they get overlooked so bad. You should really look into them. So I'm going to, and maybe we'll do an episode on them
shadows
at some point. But so yeah, what this kind of gets us into, right, is we're getting into the more abstract side of things. So I'll ask this question, which will kind of lead us into it. How have views been altered with advances in mathematics and technology and how we view locality?
Well, I probably shouldn't jump to it, but I'll hop and skip. When the industrial imperative to have trains was driving everything, then the need to be able to measure speed, to establish rate of speed, to establish how the fuel works for the train engine. So you could, in fact, say that there's a train that's going to arrive at X time at Y place. That's pretty major, because up to that point, well, people came along and roughly, maybe, there were measurement devices, but you say, well, let's meet in the afternoon. Okay.
Yeah.
And so there's that. But then we hop into Einstein and the idea of entanglement, which he called spooky. He didn't like it, and he wasn't happy with it even at the end days, but from all records. But the idea that something can be from one place, something else can be in another place, and vastly huge spaces between them, a particle, let's say, and what one does affects the other one. And there seems to be no immediate way that could happen. And so it pulls together locality and a thing called non-locality, which initially was, oh, you're just talking about one thing in one place. Now you're talking about two things, two different places. And there's no way that visibly one could see any way that one could affect the other.
Yeah. Yeah. So the speed of light is too slow to communicate between these two things, but yet they're entangled. Yeah. And so it was funny. I had a guy, actually just this week, a guy at work asked me, he goes, hey, you'll probably know the answer to this. He goes, before clocks and watches, he's like, how did people keep track of time? And I go, they really didn't on a minute level. Like, okay, people had an understanding of a year and of equinoxes and of these sorts of things.
Of the day. And
he's like, so, but before minutes and hours, what was there? I go, as far as I know, there wasn't anything. There was just sunset and sunrise. And there's, it wasn't as, time didn't play that sort of effect. And of course, Here we are back to time, whereas we're doing an episode on locality, but it's important to recognize that the two are sort of inextricably interlinked, because what have we been talking about the last several weeks? Space-time.
Space-time. And last week we talked about a book that says space and time are an illusion.
Right. And so now is probably a good time to go over kind of the two major philosophical paradigms regarding locality, right? So there's, this is a word that I've only read, so I'm going to try to say substantivalism.
Yes.
And relationalism.
Yes.
Right? So substantivalism is the idea that space is a substantive thing. It's out there, right? And that there's objects that are
separated from each other.
Yeah, that are within it, that act within space. Relationalism is the idea that space in itself really isn't there, there's just objects, and because the objects interact with each other, that creates sort of a conception of space. So when we were talking about Donald Hoffman last week, that's sort of a relationalist kind of paradigm. So what he's saying is, from the research he's done, a lot of physicists are thinking, well, maybe space-time isn't working the way that it should. It's not telling us the whole story. And we're really sort of living in a golden age of this kind of thing, because it seems like every day I'm reading a research article, right, that's saying, well, hey, now they're thinking that maybe there is no such thing as dark matter. Maybe it's a parallel universe. Maybe there's this, maybe there's that, right? And so there's still the mainstream space-time substantivalists who are trying to hold it together and say, well, these are fringe theories, these are things. But the point is they have major cosmological issues with their framework that we're sort of having a hard time addressing using the current view. So that's sort of gives an overview of the two views in location. One says space is real, it's there, and that there's objects in it. The other one says, no, there's just objects, and because they interact with each other, it's sort of, space isn't foundational, it's a emergent property of the relationship of objects.
So if we pull that down to ground, and we're sitting in your studio, do you think that you have a substantivalist position more in life than a relationalist position? Or
this is interesting, right? Because we've discussed this in various ways over the several weeks, and I think depending on how the contextual elements of the question are presented, it almost causes you to want to answer different ways, right? Because if we go back to what we've been talking about before, like if we say, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? We go, well, of course it does, right? And that's a substantivalist viewpoint, I think, right? Is that, it doesn't matter if there's nobody there to observe it, right? Space exists and things happen in it, and end of story, right? But I think that the other sort of scenario that presents the opposite to me is this idea of the end of the universe, right? If we go with the current paradigm and say, okay, well, dark energy is going to continue to just spread stuff out and things are going to get really diffuse. And then eventually there's going to be nothing, right? All the stars will burn out. All of the black holes will dissipate. There'll be nothing but just a diffuse energy field, and there'll be nothing. So there's no life. There's no consciousness. There's no anything other than just a few particles here and there. And you go, well, in that case, does space, and if you say, does space exist? I think the natural inclination is still to say yes. But if you go, does time exist? Then you go, well, it doesn't seem like time really exists if that's all there is. And space and time are one thing.
And because we don't have objects.
Yeah, there's no
motion.
Right. There's no real frame of reference. And that's where Penrose's idea of the cyclical universe pops up, where he goes, well, it's really strange, but it's really a matter of geometry, right? If you look at this gigantic empty universe, it has the same mathematical properties as in a very small, infinitely dense universe. And then a big bang happens, right? Mm-hmm. And so, it's a difficult question depending on what thought scenario you're sort of examining to think, am I a substantivalist or am I a relationalist? It's not something that I've completely gotten to either way, I think.
You don't, well, and nor do I, because it's not about committing to an ism. It's just a question to ask one to think about. What we've talked about this in the past in various contexts, but for me, when I'm creating a piece of art, I'm immersed. Well, that's a funny word. What, am I drowning in my art? And am I swimming in art? What does that mean? Immersed. It's a lovely word, but all words are problematic. So I'm immersed in working on an oil or an ink piece. And I do not notice the light diminishing and the evening beginning because I don't glance up out the window. I'm working at the canvas or at the desk with the paper. So I am not in relationship with anything other than the medium or the media and my own fingers and the brushes or the tools that take what I do with my fingers and my mind. So there's still a relation. There's a relationship, and one could argue, well, there's some substantivalist things happening there.
Right, but I think you can take it a step further, right? Because I think that that's good. Because a lot of people would say, right? Oh, well, but if you keep painting until midnight, you can't see anything. You're going to realize that, oh, well, there's more than just the relationship between me and the canvas. But I remember being a kid and stumbling through a music store and coming across the album for Rage Against the Machine's first CD for the first time and seeing the monk on the front sitting completely still, engulfed in fire, right? And you go, at that point, that is, I think that's as close as you can get to pure relationalism, right? The ability to not have any reaction at all, right? To being burned alive, right? To maintain a sense of calm like that. That's, I'm not going to go and say irrefutable evidence for relationism.
No,
but it definitely presents a strong case to saying, in this particular individual's mind, there was nothing else, right? There was nothing but his own mind in that case, right?
But I think the people generally would say, oh, I'm not particularly interested in the universe. I had lots of students say, I don't want to think about it. That's too scary.
Yeah.
So the relationalism surfaces. What I'm concerned about is my mom for this or my dad for that or my relationship with my cat or whatever it happens to be, or my studies. And so there is a substantivalism, but it's not way out from Grover's Corners into the North American continent, the Western Hemisphere. Most people don't go that far. And so there's this strange fusion of the two things, or an osmotic kind of borderland that we go back and forth with.
And I think even more so nowadays with our access to technology, right? Because I think that I was talking with a guy on another podcast about how I think a lot of the anxiety that people have these days stems from the ability to consume world news on a minute by minute basis and the ability to focus on all of these things. And, I remember being a kid, pre-internet, and your world was your town, right? Oh, hey, my friends are over here, my family's over here, I'm doing this stuff outside. And unless you decided to read the newspaper, or unless there was nothing more interesting than the news on TV, you didn't really know what was going on in the outside world. And so you didn't get stressed out about these things that were happening on a global level. Whereas nowadays it's unavoidable to encounter it. And that's not making a case for one or the other. It's just sort of establishing that that's the world that we live in, right? And I think that does sort of highlight how our concept of location affects our everyday living. And you can only imagine that if you go back even farther in time, before there was TV or before there was radio, right, that was even more so the case, right? Nobody, in the pre-industrial world, right, nobody in England was thinking about what was going on in Japan, or nobody knew about America, right. These sorts of things, and that changes your entire frame of reference as to how you relate with other places.
This is taking us into a thing called Murrayology, but I don't know if you have that on your list.
Yes, I want to do a whole episode on it, actually, but it is important because it's kind of integral to the substantivalist position. So we can talk about it.
Well, okay. Well, yeah, we don't have to dwell on it too much, but Murrayology is about the study of systems and how they fall apart, how they decompose. And so you're looking at a whole going into parts, and you're talking about boundaries between the whole and the parts. And that can go anywhere from forensic anthropology to forensic science for police work, to social issues. And so, yeah, we should talk about that separately. But I think that we're doing a bit of Murrayology in that we are deconstructing the entire universe, saying, well, but we're going down to this part. We're not going to, and people do this. We're not going to concerned with Perry, or we're concerned with New York, or whatever it happens to be for somebody's particular platter. And they didn't used to be. Not everyone had it in front of their faces all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. If you're a budding philosopher out there and you're looking to contribute in a substantive way to a field, locality is really a good place to start, because, when I was reading the Stanford Encyclopedia entry for locality, what they said is basically they're like, we're going to start with these certain assumptions, and we're going to recognize that these are extremely controversial, and there's not necessarily an objective reason why we use some of these as starting points, and some of them are circular, right? We have to take one of these assumptions as being foundational in order for the other assumptions to work, right?
Yeah.
So that tells you that thought on locality, there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do there.
There is a lot to. If we go back to your example of the Fisher person and the landowner, not water. Okay. It brings up the idea of exact location, weak location, entire location, and pervasive location. And these are mathematically tilted philosophical concepts. But for instance, did the person know about the 3 feet of water? Did he not care? Did he say, I still own that because it's within proximity? How much is the proximity? And if you're driving out of a small town, no matter where you live, anywhere on the planet, if you're walking out of a village or a town, you're driving out, however you're moving, at some point, you might say, okay, I'm past my village. But what point is it that you're past your village? Some places in the United States have a sign that says exiting Wyoming County. And then immediately you're knowing the new county that you're in. You wouldn't know it by looking at the ground.
Mm-hmm.
But then we internalize these things. But if you're walking out of Perry, or if I were walking out of Warsaw, well, if I see a sign that says South Warsaw, that's a smaller one. It's not the same place as Warsaw, but just to trust your gut. If you were walking in the woods, would you know where you were?
Yeah. And I think that does demonstrate sort of the artificial things that humans bring to it, but also the importance of how we conceptualize the basics of it, right? And so, yeah, me and Amanda, we walk a 5-mile loop, and we walk out of the town of Perry and then back into the town of Perry, and we always think that's the funniest thing, right? Oh, we left our town, right? But no, so there's a lot, like you said, you brought up some of the issues that arise out of study of locality, right? This idea of, well, can 2 things occupy the same location, right? Can one thing occupy 2 locations, right? And on and on and on. And so I think that another good question that goes with them that I didn't see in there was, when we talk about space-time, are separate locations also separate times, right? Are you and I currently in a different time?
From each other?
Yeah.
I think the physicists would say that, well, I'm not sure what Rovelli would say, because Rovelli sort of keeps giving the idea that we're all in our little pockets. But are we talking about measurable time, Greenwich Mean Time, how time feels to us, because how time feels to us, you and I are in a different time.
Yeah, and this is why I love time, right? Because it's another one of those things like we just don't have the haziest idea, right, of what's going on. Because I think this is one. Let's take it from the two main paradigms, right? If I'm a substantivalist, I say you and I are in the same time, right? Space is an objective thing. You and I are close enough together that, hey, if we wanted to split hairs, right? If we had some sort of, super expensive advanced scientific tool, maybe we could say that you and I are separated in time by
incredible.
Yes, by just scientific notation with so many zeros. That's how separated we are. It doesn't matter though, right? We're in the same time. But if you go with a relationalist viewpoint, right, then space is not necessarily the important thing. What's important is that you and I are interacting in the same time.
That's right.
But that leads to an interesting result, right? Because somebody's going to be listening to this podcast months from now, and they're going to be engaging with us, with our ideas, with our conversation. Is that going to be in the same time, right? Because if like your example with the canvas, right? If they're so engrossed with the podcast that they're listening to, that's what they're relating with at the time, and that the other spatial context that they're in doesn't really matter to them that much.
Our time.
Yeah, are they in our time?
They've walked through the bubble into our time.
And I think that that sounds crazy, right, from an objective point of view. But I think if you think about it from your own subjective humanistic experience, I think that everybody's experienced that, whether it's music or a podcast or something. Everybody's experienced that moment, right, where you're engaged with something, and all of a sudden you go, I was in that thing, not in this moment. Daydreaming, right? That's what daydreaming is it's an absence from the present moment, and it's an engaging with we don't think of it as a different time, really. We think of it as ideas, something that's happening at a conscious level. But I think that, if you're in the case of a podcast, right, where you and I are doing it at a certain time, it's historical, or you're reading a book, that was written so long ago, you almost are a time traveler at that point in some ways.
I think so. And I think that people can be in two times at the same place, experientially, or ontologically in some way. I've said this many times to people. I think that the non-medical experience of someone with dementia is, from anything that one can glean from some aspects of what is talked about, depending on the moment, they might be living 30 years in the past, or in a place that they've never been, but there they are at the same time. That they're usually going to be in two times in the same space. You might be experientially, ontologically, in two different spaces at the same time.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point, but I can also hear the empirical reductionist rolling their eyes, right?
Yes.
So let's get empirical and reductionist, right? And this is a big problem with the philosophy of locality.
Can you say that like Michael Keaton? You want to get empirical and reductionist?
So here's the problem, right? And this is a known problem with the philosophy of locality. Is all right, so we talked about how, are you and I in a different time? Well, we could parse hairs and say yes, right? Well, here's the problem, is that generally when philosophers talk about location, they shelve the idea of points in space. There's a very good reason for that, right? Because if now we try to establish, well, what is a point a location? Well, now all of a sudden, my left eye and my right eye are separated in time. So they're time travelers between each other, right? So this idea of, oh, well, you want to get wishy-washy about people listening to a podcast and being time travelers. That's ridiculous, right? Well, no, my feet and my head are in different times, technically. And if you think that sounds crazy, well, think about it relativistically. If I'm getting sucked into a black hole and spaghettified, right? My feet might be experiencing time decades or hundreds of years behind my head, right?
Yes.
And this is scientific. This is empirical and reductionist as you get.
Empirical and reductionist.
So there's problems, right?
There
There's
is a
issues.
problem. And you last week again came to this with a lot of clarity. You've done this more than once when you're talking about from your studies in neuroscience. So the amount of time that it takes for my eyes take something in and twist it and paint it and determine what's important and what's not and filter it up through different parts of the brain. That's fast, but it's still time. What I'm experiencing is not what is exactly right there.
Yes. Yes. We're never experiencing what is, we're experiencing what was, right? And your brain has some really cool filters, just like the ones on your phone, to make reality, something that you can actually apprehend, right? Because you have 2 ears. And so sounds reach those 2 ears at separate points. But if you were to constantly perceive them as arriving at separate points, it would drive you nuts. Same thing with your eyes, right? You have 2 eyes. Your brain sort of blends your binocular vision together to give you a good depth perception without giving you double images of things, right? But the sacrifice to that is accuracy, right? And so your 2 ears allow you to locate where a sound is coming from without giving you the 2 sounds, but it has to delay one of the signals in order to get the 2 to line up. And the same thing with your eyes. And so that delay causes you to be in the past, right? You're not actually engaging in the future. And our guy from NASA that was giving us the talk at the library today, he talked about some of these things, right? He said, listen, in science, nobody knows why this is the case, but you look up in the sky and you see the moon as this big, beautiful thing. That's just your brain making that up. He's like, if you hold your hand at arm's length and you put your thumb and your forefinger together, you can fit the moon into the size of an eraser head or a pea. But, my guess, because he asked people, he's like, how big do you think the moon would be if you held your arm out at arm's length? And I'm thinking like, there's people saying sizes and I'm thinking they're way over. I'm like, oh, it's probably a quarter, He said a pea or the head of an eraser. There's no way it's that small. There's no way, right? But your brain does that thing, right?
Imperial, not imperial, empiricist and reductivist.
Yeah. Or when you look at the sun, right? When we look at the solar eclipse in a couple weeks here, we're not seeing it happen. We're seeing it happen 1 second in the past. When if the sun were to explode, we wouldn't know about it for 8 minutes, right? Because it has to travel. So
that's the one that always I couldn't let that go. That for my entire life has been the measure of space and time. Really is. We really wouldn't know.
Yeah. For 8 minutes, we would just be sitting here thinking that everything was normal, right?
Then, oops.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Locality. The sun is located at such a distance that relationally, we would not be able to experience what was actually happening. Well, we know that by looking way, way deep into the universe. But when you put it really close, relatively close, to the sun, being 8 light minutes away from us, and think we can't even be sure about that relationship. It's really quite cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I always encourage people to seek out. There's a video that demonstrates how fast the speed of light is at on a galactic level, because it sort of blows your mind, and it's kind of scary how slow light is. The fastest thing in the universe, right? In 1 second, it'll wrap around the Earth 26 times or something. But when you watch it stretch out, you'd be watching an 8-minute video to watch light get from the sun to us, and you go, man, I don't have that kind of time. So locations, we went on a bit of a tangent there, but we covered the whole gamut, right? We talked about big relational aspects, but I kind of want to return to that idea of the point, right? Because when we started out this discussion and I asked you what a location is, right? That was part of part of the definition that you gave was, okay, well, if we have latitude and longitude, we have coordinates, we have points where things exist.
Yes.
And points are a real issue when it comes to philosophically studying locations. So is locality of an object ever something that can be established or only probabilistically estimated, do you think?
I think we think that we can establish it. Well, you've just acquired a new experience of life, having a position in a village or town.
Village, yeah.
And so there is a village of Perry. There is a village of Warsaw. There used to be a village of Fillmore, but it was removed. What? Thanos came along? No. The village was deconstructed on paper, and so now it's just a town of Hume that Fillmore is a part of. And Fillmore used to be a village, but it's not anymore. You can't say the village of Fillmore and be accurate. So the location can be established as a position on a map in some way, but it's not conceptually accurate anymore.
Yeah, I struggle with this, right? Because, just thinking about it, this week in school, I was watching a TED talk by a physicist, and one of the things they said that really kind of brought this idea home to me is she was talking about how people are sitting in their chairs and how their chairs are mostly empty space and the people are mostly empty space. All right, yeah, we know all that. But then she said, but you're not actually even sitting in your chairs, right? Really,
right.
The molecules in your bodies are just repelling,
pushing back.
Yeah, pushing back against the molecules in the chair. So you're really hovering across the surface of this thing, not even making contact. And you go, well, how can you ever establish the location of something then? Because you can't imagine that this repulsion is a stable thing, right? No matter how stably I'm sitting in my chair, this frothing, tension between molecules in my body and the chair is a constant motion, right?
The further you go into the quantums, the less certain you can be.
Right. And of course, they have the principle that says, okay, well, you can know the location, but not the
Heisenberg.
Yeah, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Okay, well, you can know a location, but not a direction, or you can know a direction, not a location. But it makes me wonder, can you even know a location?
Well, I think that we're back to the question that I asked before. You were talking about you and Amanda walking, or you drive out of a village. You know how fast you're going, well, roughly, because you have the speedometer if you're driving. If you're riding a bike, you've got a speedometer. Now, is that absolutely laboratory accurate? Nah.
And that's another instance. We had this happen at work yesterday. My quality manager came up to me. She said, I'm having a problem. Maybe you can help me. I go, okay, what's the problem? She says, we have these thermometers and we have to calibrate them. But the place that calibrates them won't anymore, and we can't find any outside place to calibrate them. So the only idea I can come up with for calibrating them is taking two of them and pushing them against each other, and then if they read the same temperature, knowing that they work or they're consistent. But I can't think of anything better. And I thought about it, I go, well, yeah, even if we heat, if we take a heater from a press and heat it up, we're relying on the heater to be reporting the correct temperature to the press, and then the press to be recording the correct temperature to the PLC where we view it, and then putting the thermometer to it. And then if it doesn't read accurate, we don't know if it's the thermometer or the press. Or
that's why cooking and baking are not exact sciences.
And this is the problem of epistemology as a whole, right? Is what are we basing all of our knowledge on?
What are we basing it on? So back to so now we've muddied that all up. So you're riding your bicycles or you're walking. Well, you could have a foot, a pedometer. What is it? A speedometer on your
pedometer, yeah.
Right. So you could tell the speed, but every step you take, you're not in the same place. And if you don't have the signage, there's no dotted line that says Perry ends. So you probably don't know where you are. You can know where you are when you put your foot down if you stop, but you're keeping moving. And so I think Heisenberg works that way. Two things. These are both just, they're going to seem unrelated. I'm going to try. In art, there's a thing called sfumato. Sfumato in painting is where you're working on making the meeting point between a leg and a chair, for instance, so that you're not doing, I mean, it could be a graphic illustration, just have lines that are completely crisp and sharp, but sfumato tends more toward the quantum, so that you're blurring with color very carefully. And I'm working at this. I'm just learning more about this now myself in practice, but so that when you look at a painting, you know that the figure is sitting on a chair, but you're not quite sure where the leg is and where the chair is. And that gives it a more representational feel than if you just drew it with lines on the chair, because we don't. If we look, I'm looking where I can't determine that line.
Yeah.
So there's that completely other thing. Think about when people are filming, doing a movie, and they still use the term, "Oh, we're going on location." That means you're not at a location now. No, we were pretending the location was the interior of the detective's office. We've got that in our studio. Well, but the studio's on location. Yes, but it's not the location we're pretending it is. This is a detective's office in Chicago. We're in LA. So, but if we want to go to Chicago to do exterior shots, then we're on location. I just think that little thing is so much fun.
Yeah. And I think that your example of the artistic technique is a good one, right? Because, I think in art, we can understand how it works. But in reality, right, if I'm out walking and I come across the sign that says, "Hey, you're leaving the village of Perry," well, how thick is that line, right? Is there a foot that's no man's land between Perry and Castile? Or is it a micron thin line all the way through? And as the second you step through Perry, you are in Castile. How does that, and I think that's
surveyors would tell you, but I don't even know if a surveyor could tell you how thick the line is. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah. So this idea of definition, right? I think that sort of dovetails with what I was talking about earlier about whether we can actually define a location because of things being in motion. So is there such a thing as non-motion? And if not, what does that say about locality?
Well, locality is always in motion.
Right, because I'll give an example, right? This will help us out. Bose-Einstein condensates, right? So a lot of people don't know this, but temperature is really a measurement of motion, the motion of particles, right? So I think a lot of people would think like, oh, well, so if you freeze water into ice, then it's not moving anymore. So then the temperature must be 0. Okay, well, maybe the temperature is 0 centigrade. Maybe it's even 0 Fahrenheit, but it's not 0 Kelvin. And Kelvin is absolute 0. And the fact is, we can't get anything to 0 Kelvin. And scientists have tried and tried and tried. And as a matter of fact, when they get very close to getting things to 0 Kelvin, stuff gets really weird, right? And things start actually kind of this Bose-Einstein condensate, which is when they take a fluid and they try to freeze it to absolute 0, it starts crawling up the walls of the container and doing things. So it's almost as if nature is pushing back against the very notion of there not being motion. But if there's always motion, can we ever with certainty say that there is actually location?
Not with absolute certainty. With recognizable. So I think it would be called weak location, but we could recognize. Oh yeah, we're getting close to Perry. We're walking back in. Okay, but the further out we go, no. I mean, if you tried to you put a station, a satellite, a base, something between the sun and the Earth a Lagrange point, and so there's no motion. It's still moving with the rest of us gravitationally. Everything's in motion. You can't, if on the ocean you come to a full stop with the ship, you're still not stopped because the waves, even if you kayak in a lake, any of us who've ever gone on water in any kind of vessel at all knows this. Even if you drop an anchor, you're still moving back and forth with the motion of the wave. So no, I don't think there's an absolute location.
Okay. So I'll leave off with one question, which will probably be a cliffhanger, but I think, you know what? I like ending on cliffhangers, and I'll tell you why, because we're a philosophy show. You're not here to listen to us. You're here to take in what we're saying and then to take it further, to think about it on your own, right? Yep. So if non-motion, right, if stability is impossible, then the idea of something being located, of there being stable locations, also appears to be in jeopardy, right? You can't say that there's a specific location if everything is always in motion. Do you think that that can be evidence for a relationalist viewpoint of the universe?
That's a grand question, my friend. Good thing it's a sequel. Cliffhanger. My first guess would be probably.
I go back to Rovelli, right? And Rovelli, how he conceptualizes space itself as being not a place that things happen, but actually a fabric of things. So that sounds like a substantivalist paradigm, right? But if you take that substantivalist view and then you zoom in and say, well, but things are always moving and locations are not stable. So how do you identify what is a location and what is a thing? The only way you can establish them is through their relationship to one another because of the constant motion.
Yes.
And so it would seem that the substantivalist and the relationalist thing comes to a area of, it's hard to tell if
indeterminacy.
Yes, of indeterminacy, right.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's a good demonstration of just how much work there is to do philosophically in the area of locality. So until next time, keep pondering.